So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, what structured processes companies employ to enhance benefit risk decision making. And also, same as before, talk about what the industry perspective is with regard to patients' contribution to companies' benefit risk decision making. Now, before talking really about what kind of methodology for benefit risk is advisable from an industry perspective, would like to kind of discuss for a few minutes some definitions so that we can have like a common understanding about what we mean. I mean, we see a lot in literature and in articles about qualitative models, quantitative models, frameworks for benefit risk. So I think it's important that we do have a common understanding about those. And obviously, in any benefit risk process and decision-making exercise, there are always quantitative data. The quantitative data are at the center of the discussion. So when we talk about a quantitative model, what we usually consider to be a quantitative model is a model that includes an algorithm to calculate a benefit risk score. So it's a model really that brings together all the data and calculates a single score or ratio or whatever it is. But obviously that requires superimposing value judgments, usually weights, on the efficacy and safety information to put the benefit and risk outcomes on the same scale. So this is comparing the apples and oranges. And for example, multi-criteria decision analysis is one such techniques that we can consider to be a quantitative model. It's a little bit, I think, more tricky to try to define a qualitative model, but usually we try to think about benefit risk frameworks. And on the next slide, I'll try to give you an example of such a framework, which is the Pharma-Broad framework, in which I've been involved over the last couple of years. So this is a six-step process, which was published recently in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. And it's a kind of, as I said, it's a kind of a framework really that guides you through the whole process of coming to a benefit risk decision. The first step being defining the decision context. And even though that seems to be a simple step, our experience really has shown that it is a critically important step to really try to define what the context is in which people try to make a decision. For example, what are the unmet medical needs? What is the common understanding about the medicines that are out on the market with regard to their efficacy and safety? And some of those things really are very much similar to what, for example, PROACT is trying to do and which is described in Work Package 3. But again, I think it's one of the things that one needs to spend time on before really starting to think about the data. Second step is then identifying outcomes. So these are basically your benefit and risk attributes. Really spending a lot of time on those and, for example, putting those in a kind of a value tree, which is one of the features that is also used in multi-criteria decision analysis and actually comes from that kind of theory. So really trying to spend time identifying the outcomes and do that prospectively, even before phase 3. And we think that there are already a number of companies who start to have a discussion about benefits and risks, key benefits and risks, for example, in CHMP scientific advice before phase 3. So to start to have like a common understanding also with the regulators about what are those key benefits and risks. And obviously they will evolve as phase 3 is being implemented and data are being generated. Some of these things may change. Also linking then those benefit and risk outcomes to what the data are going to be and identifying those data sources. This goes a little bit back also to what Francesco called the effects table eventually. So really trying to put in a single table the key data to come to a benefit risk decision. There's also a step in our view of customizing the framework by the time of filing, and then assessing outcome importance. All outcomes are not equally important, obviously, so there needs to be a step there, and this is a more subjective step about assessing their outcomes, and then finally quantifying and interpreting the key benefit risk metrics. So this is the 6-step framework, and then there's the final decision, obviously, and the communication of the benefit risk assessment, which is somewhat outside the actual framework. It's still, so in other words, the point is that the framework, or the Pharma-Brad framework, is kind of a tool, but obviously the decision still remains with the decision makers, be it people in industry or regulators. So going back then to the question, what structured processes do companies employ? I think we can make a distinction really between early development, where, for example, there exist a number of methods which calculate the benefit-risk profile based on a single trial. And a simple example is numbers needed to treat, numbers needed to harm. Especially in dose-ranging studies, there are some more quantitative models that can be used, but again, they have been designed really to calculate benefit risk based on a single trial, and also try to calculate what would be the optimal dose to be taken for, or doses to be taken forward into phase 3. So I'm not going to spend more time on this. That's a more kind of specialized area, and I think a little bit outside of the scope of this discussion. With regard to phase 3, as I said before, there is now a trend for companies to start to prospectively define key benefits and risks before the start of a phase 3 program. And obviously for some, in some therapeutic areas like oncology, it's even advisable to do that earlier than phase 3. And defining these key benefits and risks has some advantages. I think, first of all, it's quite useful to inform the design of the phase 3 program. Also to inform the target label. These days, companies are developing target labels quite early. So again, I think it may help defining the important things to be put in the label. But also to start to have already like an initial picture about the potential benefit-risk profile and how the new medicine may address unmet medical need. So again, it's a way to make those things a little bit more explicit than we usually did in the past. Then at the time of filing, I think there is now, we start to see an emerging trend to use some kind of benefit-risk framework. First of all, for internal decision making. So companies deciding about whether or not a product is going to be filed. Again, what's going to be, for example, the label with which it's going to be filed. Is it first, second line indication, for example, those things. Secondly, I think it also may help these kind of benefit-risk frameworks to describe the benefit-risk profile in the clinical overview. As Francesco pointed out, it remains quite challenging to put in words what the benefit-risk profile of a drug is and why, for example, the benefits outweigh the risks. It's not only in clinical overviews that you see that people have sometimes difficulty kind of articulating this, but also in any other documents, including EPARs, to really make it very explicit why the benefits outweigh the risks. And these kind of frameworks may really sharpen your thinking in this respect. And also, and I think in the future, some of those frameworks may also, or at least the outputs from some of those frameworks may also, for example, be used at CHMP hearings or at FDA advisory committee meetings. Now, it's probably, like, for example, a multi-criteria decision analysis model, which requires hours of discussion and to be put together, is not something that I think will be easily used in, for example, an FDA advisory committee meeting. Maybe the results can be used and presented, but clearly when judgment and clinical judgment has been put into the model, it's a little bit difficult to have that discussion at, for example, an FDA advisory committee meeting. But some of the frameworks here that have been used, the output of those frameworks can really be useful to discuss in an objective way at, for example, a CHMP hearing or an FDA advisory committee meeting. At this stage, I think there is still some reluctance to use quantitative models. So again, these are the models that use like an algorithm to come up with a single benefit risk score. So use of MCDA, incremental net health benefit, I think right now is still, well, I know some companies have tried to use it for internal purposes to just kind of test it. But there's still, I think, some methodological issues right now. Things that haven't been clarified. So there's still a reluctance, at least from companies right now, and I'm talking now in general, to come out with those kind of data. What I'm presenting here is really what I think is a quite simple tool, and it's also something that we developed within the scope of the Pharma-Brad framework is a kind of a forest plot. Well, actually, it is a forest plot that tries to put all the benefits and risks on the same table and in the same forest plot, really. It's kind of an alternative to Francesco's effect table, but even though it seems to be like and it is actually a very simple visual, we think that this kind of visual is really helpful to kind of put, all the benefits and risks for a given drug in one single visual, and helps really to sharpen, the idea about how the benefits outweigh the risks. Now, there's some methodological things about these, forest plots. It's not equally simple to draw them for all kind of compounds and benefit-risk trade-offs. So there's still some development that needs to be done. But the point I want to make really is that that's quite simple visuals that try to first of all, identify all the key benefits and risks. Secondly, put the quantitative data in a single table. For example, here, with the confidence intervals, is really something quite useful, and it can really be used. And there's some examples here of the advisory committee meetings where these data were put up, and really that the discussion really focused then around the data, and really gave everybody an overview of all the important benefits and risks of the drug. Now, there are still a number of quite important challenges with the use of structured processes in general, whether these are the frameworks or the quantitative models. I think we need to recognize that there are usually a lot of data out there, for a given compound in a marketing authorization application or post-marketing. So usually there are data from multiple clinical trials with possibly different designs and endpoints, also possibly meta-analyses and epidemiological studies. Safety data obviously can be generated also from multiple clinical trials and are also coming from spontaneous reporting and epidemiological studies. And they can even be, for example, interaction studies that are relevant for a benefit-risk profile. So I think we should not underestimate sometimes the amount of data and the complexity of data, which we then all try to bring into a single benefit-risk model. Capturing uncertainty is also something that we still struggle with to a certain extent. I think it also comes out in, it's one of the points also made in work package 3. The easier thing is obviously to capture statistical uncertainty, but the gaps in the efficacy and safety data and the level of evidence available, both amount and precision, is still something that in terms of all our modeling, is still something that we struggle with and that we need to improve on. Also, quite important is temporal effects of benefits and risks that need to be captured. Again, something that models, maybe with the exception of Kaplan-Meier curves, which is one of the models described in work package 2, is that we still need to do a better job on. So, for example, thinking about short-term benefits versus short-term risks, long-term benefits versus long-term risks, these are the easy scenarios. But long-term benefits versus short-term risks, for example, statins, or short-term benefits versus long-term risks, for example, oral contraceptives. I think concepts quite difficult to kind of capture in a benefit-risk decision, and that's really something that we need to do a better job on again in trying to capture in models. Also, the fact that benefit risk is obviously comparative. Comparators used in clinical trials are obviously key from this perspective, but also there are usually non-comparative data. And whether we like it or not, regulators, but also we in industry, we always think about, well, what are the medicines already on the market and what's really the unmet medical need? So this is also something we have in the back of our mind when we think about a new drug, or when we think about the benefit risk profile of an existing drug. It's always what's already on the market and what's the unmet medical needs that the drug and the subject drug is trying to address. And obviously, again, to kind of capture that well in a benefit risk model remains a challenge at this stage. Value judgment is again something that is still, I think, one of the more difficult things to do. I think it's also, again, one of the reasons why, for example, right now, companies are still somewhat reluctant to use multi-criteria decision analysis. There are various methods that exist, of course, to incorporate value judgment. There is the use of utilities, and these are published in One can just derive them, but there's some methodological issues about those. And then there are all these weighting techniques. There's simple techniques such as ranking, point allocation, preference weighting, or swing weighting. Our experience from some testing that we've done within the scope of the PharmaBrat project is that probably it doesn't really matter so much what kind of weighting technique one uses. And some of the simpler techniques like ranking or point allocation may be quite useful if one doesn't calculate like a single benefit-risk ratio. You know, very simple things may sometimes just kind of make thinking explicit and lead to kind of a common understanding of what benefits and risks are really important, or what's really are the most important ones, and which are the ones that can be more kind of discounted within the overall benefit-risk decision. Now, we need to recognize that deriving value judgments is resource intensive. It requires a group discussion. For example, in MCDA, this is the kind of the setting, you know, that one uses then to really, you know, 4 or 5, 6 hours of discussion to come to kind of a common understanding about value judgments. So it is something that is probably, as Francesco was saying, is not something that should be done, or it's indeed needed for all marketing authorization applications, probably only for the ones that are more complicated and where the benefit-risk decision isn't that obvious. There's obviously also the critique that these value judgments are subjective, but you know, and obviously that is true. The clinical judgment is a kind of a subjective feature, but right now we make those things any case implicitly, and I think you know, the question is really, can we make the value judgments more explicitly? Sensitivity analysis is highly recommended because, again, you know, the fact that the value judgments of different people are obviously different and not the same. So one needs to do sensitivity analysis to see whether any of the differences in value judgments really matter. And as I said, you know, it's probably only required for the most difficult benefit-risk evaluations to do these kind of, or incorporate these kind of value judgments. Now, this table really comes from a book of an important author really on benefit risk. And what it tries to really show is, you know, what kind of decision approaches are advisable under what kind of circumstances. The one, I think, what we, you know, when one does not use a specific benefit risk methodology or decision methodology, we usually rely on intuition to make a decision. And obviously in daily life, there's a lot of, you know, most of the time we make simple, quick decisions just based on intuition. It's not worth to spend more time or energy on something. One can argue that, especially for more complex decisions, the quality of intuition is rather low. The effort is obviously very low, but also the transparency is low because, you know, we really make the decision based on implicit values. Then there are some things like rules that one can establish, and you know, you can describe this as kind of a descriptive benefit risk framework in our language, where obviously the quality would increase. It would come to moderate quality. Still a little effort, and that's really the advantage. And the transparency is also a kind of increasing compared to simple intuition. So putting a number of simple rules sometimes around the decision is already making things a little bit more, you know, increasing the quality and increasing the transparency. Then there are these simple kind of weighting techniques that one can use. You know, even the forest plot that I put out there a couple of slides ago, where, for example, one can rank then the benefits and the risks in order of importance. That is already a kind of a weighting technique. And the quality then really increases. So you come to a high quality. The effort, well, it depends. If you do a lot of work beforehand, the effort is not that high. But if you do it all on the spot, of course, the effort is quite significant. Transparency, and that's really the advantage of doing these kind of simple techniques, the transparency is very high. And then finally, there's value analysis. And again, this is like multi-criteria decision analysis. Quality is very high of those things. If well developed, I think it's quite, you know, it's probably the highest quality decision you get. but the effort is very high as well. And again, this is why Francesco was saying that, we shouldn't probably use this for all drugs, but all medicines, but only for a selected one where we really have a difficulty and cannot use any of the other methods. But I think more important really is the transparency of value analysis is quite low. One sees the outputs and, you see nice graphs and, but how one came to the conclusion, I think is, and what was the thinking behind it is really very difficult to understand. So for someone really to understand, the output of MCDA, you really need to go in and really try to understand all the data and underlying assumptions. And that's one of the disadvantages of using, for example, multi-criteria decision analysis. So the next topic then that I would like to talk about is how do patients contribute to a company's benefit-risk decision-making? Well, first of all, I should say that I think it is good that finally there is a kind of a trend to involve more patients' views and visions in benefit-risk decision-making. There is, of course, already the use of patient-reported outcomes in phase 3 studies. That's one way. There's also anecdotal evidence, and I think companies sometimes, use that kind of anecdotal evidence as well for benefit-risk decision-making. But I think more importantly, there is now an emerging use of formal patient preference methods, which are, usually it's conjoint analysis, or it's also called discrete choice experiments. And there's a few things that these kind of methods do. They assess, first of all, the patient's willingness to accept therapeutic risks associated with more effective new treatments. They also offer a mechanism for patients to participate in decision-making, but also they can be used to understand how different stakeholders, so not only patients, may value outcomes. Now, there's a lot of literature out there and more literature about these kind of patient preference methods. It's a technique that requires, to really to be well understood. But there is really value, I think, in trying to sharpen how, what in particular, what patients are willing to accept in terms of risks for a given benefit. And sometimes we are surprised when we see the results of these kind of studies to see what kind of risks patients are really willing to accept for a given benefit. It's usually a little bit more than we would anticipate from an industry or a regulator's perspective. So to start concluding my presentation, I just want to mention a number of ongoing benefit risk initiatives. Of course, there is the EMEA benefit risk methodology project, and that's ongoing. And I think we continue to be quite pleased that the European Medicines Agency is taking a leading role in developing benefit risk methodology. Pharma in benefit risk action team in which I'm involved is also still working as I said before, they developed the broad framework, but is also now working on what is called a soft pilot. So there are 13 companies that have been trained in using the broad framework and are working right now with real drugs or applying the broad framework or related technologies. So we didn't only try to limit it to the broad framework, but if they wanted to use other benefit risk frameworks or little tools, that was obviously fine as well. And they're really trying to use that both for internal and hopefully also for external purposes. There's a consultant that has been hired who's going to have a survey completed by the end of this year to see really what the value has been of the exercise. Of course, within pharma, we're not going to see all the details because usually these were compounds in development, but we will try to understand the value of using the broad framework. So we do think that we'll have some very valuable information about what is useful, what's less useful, how, for example, how useful were the use of methods with regard to interaction with regulatory authorities. So that kind of thing. And then finally, also, as you probably know, within PDUFA 5 in the US, there is now a proposal in there to have a 5-year plan to develop and implement a stricter benefit risk assessment in the new drug approval process. There would be, as a result of that, a revision of templates and processes and procedures. There are also going to be public meetings to obtain, and that's in the, I think, 2013, 2014 timeframe. There will be public meetings to obtain patient perspectives on disease severity and on unmet medical need in specific disease areas. And I think this is really, a very useful exercise. I think also here in Europe, or even, if one wants to use multi-criteria decision analysis or wants to use benefit-risk frameworks, really trying to lock down a framework or a quantitative model for a specific disease area with the input of patients and other stakeholders, I think is really something that we need to go to. Developing frameworks in general each time on the spot for a new drug, I think is not very wise, but one really needs to think beforehand, prospectively, about, well, what's the unmet medical need in a specific disease area, what are the key benefits and the key risks, and really try to define that prospectively. So any, I think, kind of exercise to do that with all stakeholders, including patients, industry, prescribers, regulators, would be, I think, time well spent. And then there would also be training of staff. Of course, from an industry perspective, what's going to be important is that eventually that regulatory authorities globally use a similar framework. And we'll see whether that's going to materialize or not, but I think it is quite important from our perspective that we don't have very divergent frameworks or tools, benefit risk tools that will be used in the different regions. Of course, the way that these frameworks or tools would be used could be somewhat different because of different regulatory setting, but hopefully the frameworks themselves or the models are going to be very similar in the US, Europe, and in other regions. So the learning objectives of this talk were really, to try to explain what structured process companies employ to enhance benefit risk decision making. I try to demonstrate that there is an emerging use of benefit risk frameworks. There is maybe some selected use already of quantitative frameworks, but again, I think there still needs to be more work in this area. And in general, there needs to be many more development of methods and in particular case studies. So I think it's, all of this is just emerging. So we really need people to work on this, need to, publications on these, need to have public discussions around the value of specific models and case studies. And then with regard to patients' contributions, I try to show that there is in particular an emerging use of patient preference methods. Thank you very much.